I literally do not know where to begin. 24 hours on our nation's border. What an experience. I felt very lucky to have been asked, made the effort to get there, which is never simple with a busy schedule. It was well worth it. I saw things that will impact me for years to come. I experienced not the entire system. We didn't see everything, but we saw a lot. So it's given me a much better lens for being able to articulate the challenge in a real way. I mean, I think elected officials throughout the country who care about this issue are doing their best to articulate the challenges, to understand the challenges, but there's nothing like being on the ground, seeing things, observing, asking questions. In a second, I'm going to talk to you about what we did, and then I'll share my impressions, but I want to compliment the entities that invited us for their transparency. Customs and Border Patrol made it clear that they don't let the facilities know that groups are coming, whether it be congressmen and women, federal electeds, agency folks, local leaders like myself. And I was asked actually by one media outlet whether or not it might have been, they might have gotten notice, and that was just impossible. The scope of their operations is so large, and we were in so many different settings and places that I just don't think it would have been possible. So with that, yes, it was a rewarding experience. And, you know, I approached the journey not really knowing what I would take out of it at some sense. I've worked on this issue for many years. I care about this issue. But I was surprised at the amount of access they gave us, the level of transparency. And it was like drinking out of a fire hydrant for the entire 24 hours that I spent on the ground engaged in this complex challenge. So with that, I'm going to real quickly tell you where we went. And I don't know, do we want to go through the, why don't we do this? Why don't we go through the slides? I'll show you. That'll give you a sense because they're sequential as to where we went. And then I'll make a couple of comments. So this is our group. This is the National Association of Counties hosted this. They weren't able to invite a bigger group than this. This is Councilmember Schmidt from Wisconsin, Mr. Murdoch's from rural Oregon. We had Melissa McKinley's from Palm Beach, a couple of others from, our chair of our task force is from Florida as well. So we had people from around the nation who participated for various reasons. So it was a really great group, but they wanted it small, so we did not take staff. Not only was that a cost-saving measure, but it was also created some efficiency for us to be able to travel as quickly as we did. This is our, the previous slide was our briefing in the morning. Okay, so this is a gentleman who, with Customs, who gave us a couple, maybe a 90-minute tour of the Customs side. We were at the, I want to get this right, Paso del Norte port of entry on the Customs side. So for any of you who have been through a foreign country, you know, you stand in line with your passport, your screen. So they have those traditional operations. But they also have the behind the scenes when somebody is held back or is not able to clear through the traditional means. And that's where we went behind the scenes and witnessed that process. Prior to this shot, they took us in and they told us no photos. So most of what we saw, you know, yesterday, you're not going to see photographs for because there were people being processed internally at every turn in some, you know, some point in the process. So we had just walked in, first stop after our briefing, after our transportation, and first thing we saw was a makeshift daycare. So I had not I'd wondered how many detainees I would witness, how many I would interface with. The first experience was a daycare setting. And you had a very kind customs official, female, dressed the same way these gentlemen are, working with these children. And they were kind, their faces had smiles, they were doing their job. But how's that as a child, to have that your first experience in a daycare setting, having crossed the border with your parents, to be greeted with this? And it was a little rough. So then you can go back one, Abby, so I talk about this photo. We were just getting a general briefing as we were seeing over on this side volumes of people coming through with their passports, traditional, as I mentioned. I was standing, and I probably took this picture, so I was standing over here, and near the station over here was a little boy who approached. I noticed him. I was paying attention, but I was kind of more interested in what was happening over at the processing stations for the traditional passports. A little boy walked up. Sorry. I think I'm going to have a little bit of, I don't know if the word's trauma from this for some time. The young boy approached, no family, alone, with a Colorado birth certificate, no passport, my son's age. I'm going to say 14 years old, maybe 13. He was scared. I don't know his story. I never will. Was that a doctor birth certificate? Was he returning to a family? I mean, we were in Texas. That said Colorado. I don't know if that little boy right now has been moved to the Children Only Center, the place that Health and Human Services runs, that we've seen so much about, the quote-unquote cages. If that little boy, they let him through, and off he went, and he met his parents just as he walked through. I have no idea what happened to that little boy. But it seemed odd to me, right? A Latino child, very young, no family with him, without a passport. And that was just one of hundreds of individual cases that I witnessed over the course of my 24 hours on the ground there. So I'll tell you, I fought back tears just now. They were flowing yesterday, more than once. Okay. So you'll see the line. These are people. Now, at first I was sort of shocked by this. I'll tell you, I was in that same line later in the day. So when I took the photo, I figured these people were backed up for very slow processing, and I don't really think that's the case. The border at this checkpoint in El Paso, right now I'm standing in El Paso looking over to Mexico. This photo is taken with traditional border operations, what you might expect, cars going through. There's the line of people, and again, it actually moved pretty quickly. This is the screening area. You'll see as you come through. I think I crossed the border when I was in college from Tijuana once. Same thing. You've got the lanes. You have a fast lane for people who move over on a regular basis. And that was a point raised to me by my friends from the El Paso area, elected officials and others, that there's so much commerce going back and forth on a regular basis. And the city, the Mexican city and El Paso are, in many respects, one city. I mean, they're literally joined in terms of their geography, but they're also reliant on each other. Okay, so after I finished the tour with Customs, we were handed over in the same building to the Border Patrol side of operations. They wear different color uniforms. These guys are in green. And after a briefing, we headed off to the next location. But they wanted us to actually drive along the border. So this is the border. We're standing in in El Paso, looking over at the Mexican city on the other side, Juarez. So what you're seeing is, as we approached, we were in a transport vehicle, with Border Control and just getting a traditional briefing was a family crossing the border. We didn't expect it. So the last thing I expected to witness was a true apprehension of a family on our nation's border. And you can see the mom, we blurred out the faces. We didn't need to because they were under custody. They said, yeah, you can do what you want. I felt for privacy. This isn't the father. This is another young boy. This child, I'm guessing, is 15 to 16 years old, very small child, mom, fairly young, I would guess 30, and then this young girl. The officer spoke to her in Spanish, and this is just my bad memory, she was either from El Salvador or Guatemala, and she confirmed to the officers that she was leaving due to poverty, very rough conditions, and trying to seek a better life for her family. Later in the day, I asked the customs officers, I said, why would she have chosen to just cross there and not go through the line and say, I'm here for asylum, which was the case with many. And they basically said that she potentially could have been carrying drugs, and this could have been a setup. They said that she might just not have been really educated on the system. That does happen. Most people crossing are seeking asylum and looking for legal protection and looking to have their case reviewed. The word's out, and they would go probably through that line of people through the port of entry rather than the border. I didn't believe it. I think it would take a lot to pull that off. The fear in their eyes, their nervousness, but I'll talk about this in a minute, but this wasn't our first interaction with this family. So previously when we were with Customs, they did take us to the screening area. They have advanced screening. If a car has a red flag for some reason, doesn't buzz through, they bring it, they stop it, they search it, and they have the technology now to look at to do a review of the vehicle. They're looking for altered vehicles that are carrying drugs, and other, I guess, drugs primarily. But so they know the make of the vehicle, they know how to search. You can advance the slide, Abby, and you'll see similar. You can go one more. This was not the day that I was there. This is a historical photo, but you'll see they're able to screen on site, and this particular vehicle's carrying lots of pounds of something. So that vehicle is obviously apprehended. This is our transport vehicle to move around as we moved with with Border Patrol. So many of you guys may know this. I was asking a lot of questions, learned a lot. All the pieces came together by the end of the day for me. But so a customs customs operation will handle traditional entry. As people are crossing the border that are checked by the system, they don't have passports, there may be an issue. The customs officials will note it and move them through the system behind the scenes, as I witnessed. I believe El Paso has 4 different bridges for different purpose, and if there's an area that the Border Patrol will cover the area not traditional to the customs process, like the area outside of the bridge. These Border Patrol officers were covering, under their jurisdiction, I think 11 miles of the border. And so if you see, as this family chose to cross not through the port of entry, it's their job to apprehend. So that's their business. They were giving us the tour, and it was just after loading into this van that we came across that family. I found it interesting just standing when we went out to observe the situation with the family. They were just shoes. And I caught those 2 just left over. Just makes you wonder. This is us leaving to cross the border on foot at the end of, or after we had gone through the review of customs and out with Border Patrol. We were walking for efficiency, so that was the best dollar I spent during the day, 50 cents over, 50 cents back. It was about a 15-minute walk, and then we were met on the other side of the border by a van. The van took us to a site, a humanitarian site, basically, a shelter for refugees. And in a bit, I'll talk about what I consider to be a failure of our federal government that even led to the facility that we visited. It's a new facility. It's been up and running for 6 months, but we're headed out there. Just a photo where I'm on the bridge looking into Mexico. So we got to the site. It looked to a certain degree like the new centers that we're opening here, except it was larger. And I believe they had about 700 people of non-Mexican nationality, but from Central American countries primarily. And this is how they fed them. The food was actually really good. I had a little taste of the soup in this big pot. This is a massive kitchen, and these pots took two very burly guys to carry it over to the food line. And so we witnessed this refugee center, very clean, very well run, and run by the Mexican government. That's it? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little about the policy that led to our tour of that center. So after the very large number of refugees, those seeking asylum, passed over this border last spring, the system was incredibly stressed. And the Customs and the Border Patrol people we talked to will admit that. They admit that there were failures within the system. They observed situations that were created violence within them that were inhumane, a lot of legitimate, a breakdown in the system. But what they said is, we don't control the ceiling. And so I had a kind of exchange with them, because ultimately the sheriff, I, and the council can say, hey, we're done. We're going to set our ceiling at our Salt Lake County Jail at a certain level. And we do have a soft ceiling now. We try and work within it with our policies. Border Patrol and Customs do not have that allowance. They serve everyone. They have a process. They have a very systemic way of doing things. The system was tested beyond its limits some time ago. In response to that, and whether or not it was directly in response or just based on this president's ideas of what should and shouldn't be done with implementation of immigration policy, there was a decision made to create a program where no longer, if you do qualify for asylum, if you get through the system, you qualify for asylum, you are not, the previous system was to let you off on your own to come back for your court date. They are now moving individuals into Mexico and not allowing them to remain in the United States until the trial dates. So we have taken thousands of people over the last few months, moved them back into Mexico, and we have asked one of the poorest countries in the nation not to take care of their own people, but to take care of other refugees from surrounding areas. And I'll tell you, they were doing a good job. That was a well-run shelter. The Mexican government is operating it, or is providing the funding. It's private operators. The custom officials actually complimented the NGOs, the nonprofit organizations that are partnering for this. And Mexico had stepped up in a way that I think it's basically us passing the buck. Which for a nation like ours is yet another asterisk on the failure of this immigration policy. So that's a little bit about the trip. I've handed out takeaways. I'm going to touch on a couple of them. We all know the immigration system is broken, and I saw it with my own eyes. This tour was informative, heartbreaking, and enlightening, and I think it'll better prepare me as a mayor for the future and re-engage me on a true attempt at being a partner in solutions. The day that I spent there, I witnessed hundreds of people being processed through the system. And again, I didn't expect that. I thought I might see a family, I had children come up and kind of hold on to my legs or try and engage with me, and we were asked not to engage. We broke the rules. We would give smiles, we would give some sign of affection to them, just because the environment is so sterile that I don't know that any of us would feel we were doing the right thing if we didn't in some way acknowledge the presence. Even the most hardened conservative among us, and we got to know who that was in the beginning in our early interaction and asking questions together as a group before we departed, and even he was recognized and expressed a recognition that his impressions were wrong. We did not see people acting out. We didn't see anybody actively in distress. People were very calm. They were respectful of the authorities. And again, I saw a lot of families. There were single men. We saw that section, but the Customs and Border officials were sharing with us that depending on the time of year, you'll get more families versus men. And, I think there's this sense that we're processing people from Mexico. Mexico's actually number 5 right now, I believe. At times, there's quite a few people coming in from Brazil. That one surprised me. Cuba. The Cuban policies are shifting immigration our way right now, or the political shift in Cuba at this moment in time. El Salvador, Central American countries where you have really violent conditions and areas of poverty. So I think that's enough for throwing a few things your way, and I'm happy to take questions.
What was the cost of this to the county?
Right around $1,000. Do you have the exact amount?
It was $1,071.66.
And I would say that's the best $1,000 our county has spent in quite a long time.
About some of the outcomes and why you feel like it was important. You have that in this document.
Yeah, so we are engaged as a county with this community. We have a growing Latino population. Our economy is largely energized and reliant on people who come here from other nations, including the nations that are represented by people crossing our border. I started as a community advocate years ago at Voices for Utah Children and worked on these issues then and witnessed families living in the shadows where you have a mixed situation in a family where the children are citizens, the parents are not, and the complication in the family when you can't work towards citizenship. I have talked to numerous recipients of DACA protections, who are here going to college, starting jobs, vibrant young people who as children were holding someone's hand crossing that border, but who grew up in this community, and they are vital members of our community, and they live with uncertainty. So if they, on a moment's notice, would have to depart, the impact on that family. We've seen Immigration, Customs, ICE move people out of our community. There's fear of that. The president just a couple weeks ago said that we're going to have some big raids. So we're living that at this moment in time in so many complex ways. And I think it's important that once again the local government step up when the federal government has failed. And this isn't the first time. I mean, for heaven's sakes, we had to build bathrooms up the canyon because the National Forest Service didn't have funding, and we found it in this county's budget because that is a demand of our constituents. And when the federal government will not solve the problem, it's up to mayors, county electeds, commissioners, governors, we're picking up the pieces. So yeah, I mean, there was a little bit, I'm going to be honest, there was a little bit of an undertone, hey, you know, the county, what does it have to do? Why should the mayor go down there? I'm telling you, that's the best $1,000 this county has spent.
So what can you as a county mayor do though when this is happening at the border? What specifically do you plan to do here
So,
as a county mayor?
Thank you. Our task force is bipartisan. Many of the elected officials I was with are Republicans. They are representing their communities. They too are frustrated with Congress. I don't blame any one congressman or woman on the inability to move forward. I think we walked away feeling like there were 2 or 3 things we could individually advocate for right now. And we also are going to double down on this problem to come up with some suggested local solutions. And the task force, our next gathering, will include Health and Human Services, who are running the child detention centers. It will include Customs and Border Patrol. It'll include Department of Justice. The system's too slow right now. That was one of the big takeaways. We got to speed up this system. The earliest court dates, I'm told, are summer of 2020. That's 8-9 months away. So, yeah, I think that advocacy is really key. And I do think we're living solutions every day. We're working and we support in this county our Office of New Americans. And through that effort and Z's efforts, you know, her daily work is to go out there on my behalf and help solve this problem locally until we can have that federal fix. I personally, and we talked about this in our debrief, I believe that we should ask Congress to create a special envoy that, you know, will send a senior leader off to a nation that needs additional, or previous administrations did. I haven't seen this president do it, but in the past, if you see a sticky situation overseas, you create a special envoy and you send that team over and you engage. We need a special team to work on this. Our congressmen and women, our senators have full days and demands, and I don't know that the congressional structure, as a former congressional staffer, is set in a way to solve this problem. There is a bipartisan congressional task force, and I think I would hope that they would review their own methods, systems, timeline, and appropriate funding to get the right people in the room to move forward a congressional proposal. And then we had a press conference yesterday and we talked about the need to stop the finger pointing and the partisanship and come up with cooperative solutions.
It sounds like the quote-unquote crisis at the border isn't the massive invasion of people swarming the border, is it?
I think it was at one time. I mean, every time I turned around and had a briefing, they talked about last spring and how tested the system was. And I was also trying to better understand why things are relatively manageable yesterday. I mean, in the sense that the process was working, people are moving through the system. There were still hundreds and hundreds of people at various stages in this process that I observed directly. But we will see more peaks. The more peaks that we have with populations crossing the border, the more extreme situations the humanitarian impact will rise again, right, if we don't solve this. And so I just think they're kind of managing an ebb and flow. And they showed us how they would change the perimeter to put a certain separated group here or there next as they sort through next steps for the population that are seeking asylum, refugee status, or if they know that they need to turn them over to Department of Justice or what have you.
I know you talked about this, but why were you so struck by that little boy who came up to you and just looked scared? I mean, just like, what about the environment? You called it heartbreaking, just again.
Well,
what
I mean,
about it?
I think it's because, I went down there as a policymaker mayor, but I had to take my mother's self. I think it's, just traveling with my kids, even within the country, our own country. We go to a new city, it's new for them, right? So the idea of a young child without parents, without a guardian, alone at 14 crossing a border, and the uncertainty of knowing what happened, and would that child, I was told that the child detention area was seeing, a couple of dozen. I don't know if that's true. I believe it was. They seemed credible in sharing that information. Seemed consistent with the other kind of orderly operations we witnessed. But it's more than possible that that child is there right now, not knowing his own fate. And to cross through alone, have a border agent looking over the birth certificate, asking questions. I was under the impression that, and the boy had been there some time, that the next step was going to be that he would be removed to the back of the room and perhaps be alone for some time. And you also wonder and this is true of also the family, what have the last 2 weeks been like for them? What have the last 2 years been like for them? I'm told that many, sell all of their property to attempt this crossing. And they're leaving the very little that they have. So not knowing his story before or his future was, as a mother, really moving to me.
Are families still being separated, or is that a thing? Or?
Good question. So I had 24 hours to try and put the pieces together, so let me tell you what I do know. So if a family comes through traditionally together, like let's take this one family for example. I forgot to mention we did see them in the processing center later. The Border Patrol took them to a satellite center. It's brand new. It was a good, clean, fairly well organized center. Nothing luxurious by any means, but a lot of people in it. But so in a big room, they separate the women and the children from the men, all in one room with 2 guards and a guard station in the center of the room, like a makeshift guard station. Snacks, diapers, several, things set out for them to eat. The kids are running around together. I was a little disappointed to see the kids didn't have books or anything to help pass the time, nor did the adults. Told they wouldn't be there. I mean, the longest they would be there at that point would be a day and a half, perhaps, depending on their individual situation. But their Border Patrol would be reviewing their papers to determine what their situation is. At that point, the family is in the same room together, but the men will be separated. At that point, it just depends. I mean, they're either at that point going to go be eligible for refugee status or asylum and have a future court date. In that case, the nonprofit organization will help them in Mexico, but they're going to be sent back to Mexico as a family. The other option would be if one of the parents has a criminal background, then indeed they would be separated, and that, but perhaps not the other, would go off. It was interesting. Anybody can go back at any time without prosecution or without a record. I don't know if there's a record made that they'd crossed. There probably is, but without a consequence, they can return. So the separation in that case would be limited. They are separating children from their grandparents at that first stop, which is a policy change that needs to take place. That's one of our takeaways, was there should be a change in the law that allows the grandparents to stay with the children. So that would be a separation, and I'm unsure when the reunification would occur.
So you went on this trip during Welcome Week.
Mhm.
Do you have a message for people who may be in Salt Lake County without legal documentation, or people who are coming from another country who are here?
Yeah, I mean, we have an ethic, not just at Salt Lake County, but we have an ethic in this community of love thy neighbor. And I think that that is a shared value and ethic for all Utah citizens and residents. And, we have our political differences, but I do believe we care for each other. So as a welcoming community, I think it's incumbent upon me to back that up with attention and resources and effort made, and Z does a great job. She was here prior to me becoming mayor, but I value her work and her engagement in the community and participate as much as I can, not just in sharing my priority that we remain a welcoming community, but additionally that we are helping to solve problems. So I think what I do want to share in this welcoming week is that we'll do everything we can to back that value up with action and help work towards solutions and support.
Anything else? Everybody got what they need? All right.
Thank you.